house on Willow Creek Road was always too quiet. Claire had bought it 3 years after her divorce, thinking peace would heal her. At first, the silence comforted her. She could read, paint, and make tea without anyone interrupting. But over time, the silence became heavy. Some nights she turned on the TV just to hear another voice. Other nights, she stood by the window, staring at the empty driveway, wondering how life had become so still. Then came the phone call that changed her routine. Her cousin Mark called one late afternoon. "Claire," he said, "do you still have that guest room? I have a friend who just came back to town and needs a place for a while." Claire hesitated. She wasn't used to sharing her space anymore. "He's quiet," Mark added quickly. "You'll barely notice him. Just needs a place to land until he finds something." His name was Adam. When he arrived 2 days later, rain drizzled over the porch roof. He stepped inside carrying 2 suitcases, his gray hoodie damp from the weather. "Thank you for letting me stay," he said, his voice calm but tired. Claire noticed his eyes. Soft brown, kind, but distant, like someone who'd been carrying too much for too long. "It's fine," she replied. "Guest room's down the hall. Bathroom's across it. Kitchen's yours whenever you need." They exchanged polite smiles, strangers sharing a roof. That first week passed quietly. Adam worked long hours on his laptop, mostly from the dining table, sometimes stepping outside for calls. Claire often caught herself listening to the low tone of his voice. Professional, steady, warm. He always cleaned up after himself, always said thank you when she made coffee or dinner. Gradually, the awkward silence of 2 strangers turned into something softer. They began to talk. Small things at first. Weather, the neighborhood. A funny thing the delivery guy said. Adam had a dry sense of humor that often caught Claire off guard. The first time she laughed around him, she surprised herself. It had been months since laughter felt easy. One evening, as fall painted the trees gold, Claire sat by the window editing a manuscript. Adam came back from a run, sweat on his forehead, breath steady. "Storm's rolling in," he said, glancing at the sky. "You might want to bring the plants in." She nodded, watching the horizon darken. She didn't like storms much. They made the house feel alive in all the wrong ways. Walls shaking, branches scraping against glass, power flickering. She always felt small in moments like that. By nightfall, rain came hard, pounding the roof. The lights flickered, then went out completely. Claire sighed. Of course, the storm had found her again. She grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the living room, where Adam was already lighting a candle. "Looks like we're officially camping indoors," he joked. The warm light danced across his face, casting shadows that made the room feel smaller, closer. Claire smiled faintly. "You're good at this," she said. "You must have done this before." "Too many times," he replied. "I used to work in places where power outages lasted for days. You learn to appreciate candles after that." They sat on opposite couches, the storm outside raging while the candle flickered between them. The air hummed with quiet tension. Not discomfort, but something unspoken, delicate. Claire hugged a blanket around herself. "When I was a kid," she said softly, "my mom used to make hot chocolate during storms. She said thunder was just angels bowling." Adam chuckled. "My dad said thunder was the clouds bumping into each other. I used to believe him." Lightning flashed, followed by a deep rumble that shook the windows. Claire flinched and Adam noticed. He reached out, resting a steadying hand on her shoulder. The touch was brief, gentle, but it sent a wave of warmth through her she hadn't felt in years. "Hey," he said quietly. "It's just a storm. You're safe." For a moment, Claire forgot about the noise outside. She looked at him, really looked, and realized how his calm filled the space where her loneliness had lived. Their eyes met, and something wordless passed between them. Then, just as suddenly, the power came back on. The lights blinked, the heater hummed, and the moment vanished. Claire straightened, her cheeks warm. "Well," she said, forcing a small laugh. "That was dramatic timing." Adam smiled faintly but didn't speak. He blew out the candle, the faint trail of smoke curling between them. "Good night, Claire," he said, his tone soft but unreadable. "Good night," she whispered. When he disappeared down the hall, she stood alone in the flickering light of the lamp, wondering why her chest felt both full and hollow. She had told herself she was done with feelings like this, that love was a chapter she'd already closed. Yet, one quiet evening and one storm had reminded her how fragile her calm truly was. Later that night, lying in bed, she couldn't sleep. Rain tapped at the windows. She listened for his footsteps, but the house was still again. Only now the silence wasn't empty. It was charged, heavy with something she didn't want to name. She tried to dismiss it as simple gratitude. Adam had been kind, steady, just a good man in a moment of fear. That's all it was, she told herself. Nothing more. But deep down she knew that wasn't true. Something had shifted. As the wind softened and the rain faded to a whisper, Claire turned on her side, facing the wall. For the first time in years, she didn't want to be alone. And somewhere down the hall, Adam sat on his bed, staring at the same storm through a different window, wondering why he couldn't stop thinking about the look in her eyes when the thunder rolled. Both of them knew something had changed, but neither was ready to admit it. Not yet. The storm passed before morning, but the silence that returned wasn't the same. It wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting, and deep down, both of them felt it, the quiet before something neither of them had expected. The morning after the storm, sunlight poured through the kitchen window, glinting off the coffee pot. The air smelled like rain and fresh starts. Claire moved quietly around the kitchen, trying not to think about the strange warmth she'd felt the night before. She told herself it was nothing, just a moment, a simple act of kindness. But every time she heard Adam's footsteps down the hall, her pulse quickened. He walked in, wearing a navy t-shirt, his hair still damp from a shower. "Morning," he said, his voice soft but clear. "Morning," she replied, keeping her eyes on the coffee mugs. He poured himself a cup and leaned against the counter, watching her for a moment. "Thanks again for letting me stay," he said. "I know it's not easy sharing your space." "It's fine," Claire said quickly, maybe too quickly. "You've been a good guest." They exchanged polite smiles again, but now the air between them felt different. It wasn't the awkward silence of strangers anymore. It was something unspoken, waiting. Days turned into weeks, and the house began to feel alive again. Adam fixed small things. A creaky door, a loose shelf, a light switch that hadn't worked in years. Claire found herself cooking more, setting 2 plates instead of 1 without even thinking. They never talked about what had changed since that night, but both of them knew it had. One evening, she came home from the library to find him sitting on the porch steps, guitar in hand. The sun was setting behind him, painting the sky gold and pink. His fingers moved slowly across the strings, the melody calm and familiar. "I didn't know you played," she said, surprised. He looked up, smiling slightly. "It's just something I used to do when I needed to think. Helps quiet the noise. Can I listen?" she asked. He nodded and she sat beside him. The music filled the air between them, gentle, soulful, almost nostalgic. Claire closed her eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over her. It reminded her of summers long ago, when she believed love could fix anything. When he stopped, she said quietly, "You should play more often. It suits you." He looked at her for a long moment before saying, "Maybe I will, if you promise to listen." Something in his tone made her chest tighten. She smiled, trying to hide the way her heart fluttered. After that evening, the bond between them grew naturally. They started sharing small things, morning coffee, late-night talks, quiet dinners. Adam told her bits about his past, how he'd worked overseas, how a long-term relationship had ended when distance got in the way. Claire shared her own stories, about her failed marriage, the loneliness that followed, and how she'd learned to rebuild piece by piece. Neither of them pushed for more. It was as if they both knew that whatever was happening needed time to unfold. Then came another storm, weeks later. It wasn't as strong, but it brought the same restless energy. The wind howled, and rain lashed against the windows. Adam was in the kitchen when Claire came in, holding 2 mugs of tea. "Another storm," she said, smiling faintly. "Seems like they follow you." He took a mug from her hand, their fingers brushing. The touch lingered, longer than it should have. Neither spoke. They sat together on the couch, the room lit only by a small lamp. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Claire tucked her legs under a blanket. "Funny," she said softly, "how storms used to scare me. Now I almost look forward to them." Adam turned to her. "Why?" "Because they make the world feel closer, like everything slows down, just for a while." He studied her for a moment before replying, "Maybe it's not the storm that changed. Maybe you did." She met his gaze and time seemed to stop. There was no thunder then, no rain, just the weight of his words settling deep in her heart. Before she could respond, the lights flickered again. This time neither of them moved to fix it. They just sat there, quietly watching the shadows shift around them. Later that night, after the rain stopped, Claire stood by the window, staring at the reflection of her own face, calm, but confused. She didn't want to fall for anyone again. Love had once broken her so deeply she wasn't sure she could survive it twice. But with Adam, it wasn't chaos. It was calm. It was steady, like the quiet heartbeat of the house they now shared. The next morning, she decided to keep her distance for a while. She needed clarity. So she started working longer hours at the library, avoiding the kitchen when he was around. Adam noticed, of course, but he didn't ask why. He just gave her space, though his eyes sometimes followed her with a look she couldn't quite read. Days passed like that. Careful, quiet, strained. Then one evening, Claire came home late to find him waiting on the porch again, this time without his guitar. "Did I do something?" he asked gently. She froze. "No, of course not." "Then why does it feel like I lost you and I don't even know how?" His words hit her harder than she expected. "You didn't lose me," she said softly. "I just needed time." "Time for what?" "To remember who I am without someone else," she whispered. "Every time I start to care for someone, I feel like I'm losing myself again." Adam took a step closer. "Caring for someone doesn't have to mean losing yourself, Claire." She looked up at him then, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. The same eyes that had calmed her through storms, that had quietly filled her lonely home with warmth. She wanted to believe him. Before she could say anything, the porch light flickered above them, buzzing softly. Adam smiled faintly. "Seems like this house likes drama," he said, breaking the tension just enough to make her laugh. It was a small laugh, but real. And in that moment, she realized something. He wasn't just someone who had entered her life. He was becoming part of it. When she went inside that night, she couldn't sleep again. The quiet house that had once felt like safety now felt like a question she couldn't answer. She stood in the hallway, staring at his closed door, wondering if love could really start in the most ordinary of ways. 2 people, 1 roof, and the space between them slowly closing. The next morning, she found a small note on the counter beside her coffee mug. It read, "Leaving early today. Don't let the quiet get too loud." She smiled softly. The note shouldn't have meant much, but somehow it did. The quiet wasn't heavy anymore. It was filled with him, and though neither of them had said it yet, both knew. Something real was beginning, even if they didn't have the courage to name it. The days that followed were strange for both of them. The silence between Claire and Adam wasn't uncomfortable anymore, but it wasn't peaceful either. It was charged, like the air before a storm. They were careful, polite, and yet every glance felt heavier than it should. Claire tried to convince herself that whatever she was feeling was temporary. Adam was younger, kind, and gentle, but he was also someone she'd promised herself not to fall for. He was just a friend, or at least that's what she kept repeating. One late afternoon, the sky turned gray again, and a slow drizzle began. Claire was in the kitchen making soup when Adam walked in, shaking rain from his jacket. "You'll catch a cold if you keep doing that," she said without looking up. "Maybe," he replied with a grin. "But at least you'll have someone to test your soup on." She rolled her eyes but smiled. "You talk too much for a sick person." He leaned on the counter, watching her stir the pot. "You've been avoiding me lately," he said quietly. "Did I do something wrong?" She froze, the spoon still in her hand. "No, you didn't," she said softly. "I just needed to think." "About what?" "About us," she whispered, before realizing the word had slipped out. Adam blinked, caught off guard. "Us?" Claire exhaled, placing the spoon down. Whatever's happening between us, it's complicated," he nodded slowly. "Maybe, but complicated doesn't mean wrong." His voice was calm, steady, but filled with something deeper. She turned to face him, searching for words, but all she could see was the sincerity in his eyes. It scared her how much she wanted to believe him. Before she could say anything else, the lights flickered again. She laughed nervously. "Seems like the house doesn't want us to talk." "Or maybe it does," Adam said, stepping closer. For a long moment, they just stood there, the sound of rain against the window filling the space. Claire's heartbeat was so loud she was sure he could hear it. She took a step back, needing distance. "Adam, I can't," she said quickly. "You don't know what you're asking." He didn't move closer this time. He just said softly, "Then tell me what's stopping you." Claire looked down. "Fear. I've already lost once. I can't go through that again." Adam took a slow breath. "I'm not him, Claire. I'm not here to leave." The words hit her harder than she expected. He didn't need to explain. She knew what he meant, but the past had built walls around her heart, and it wasn't easy to let anyone in. She turned away, pretending to check the stove, but her hands trembled slightly. Dinner that night was quiet. They sat across from each other, eating in silence, the air thick with unspoken things. Every so often she'd catch him watching her, and she'd quickly look away. When the meal was over, Adam offered to wash the dishes, and Claire went to the living room, sitting by the fireplace. The rain had stopped, and the night was unusually still. She heard footsteps behind her. Adam stood there, drying his hands with a towel. "Do you ever stop overthinking?" he asked gently. She smiled faintly. "Not really. It's a bad habit." He came closer, standing beside the fire. "You don't need to protect yourself from everything. Sometimes people really mean what they say." Claire looked up at him, her voice barely a whisper. "And what are you saying, Adam?" "That I care," he said simply. "More than I probably should." The words hung in the air, soft but impossible to ignore. Claire didn't answer at first. She stared into the flames, the glow dancing across her face. Her heart was torn between caution and something that felt dangerously close to hope. She finally looked at him and said, "You don't know what it's like to lose yourself in someone and then have to find every broken piece afterward." Adam knelt beside her, his expression calm. "Then let me help you pick up what's left. I'm not here to fix your past, Claire. I just want to be part of your now." For a moment, she couldn't breathe. His words were so simple, but they carried more truth than anything she'd heard in years. Then, suddenly, the fireplace crackled loudly, sending a spark into the air. They both laughed, the tension easing slightly. "Guess the house agrees with you," she joked. Adam smiled, his eyes soft. "Maybe it does." That night, after he went to his room, Claire stayed up by the fire, thinking. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone, but that only made her more afraid. Afraid of losing what they had. Afraid of crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The next morning, she found a small note taped to the fridge. "Gone to help a friend with repairs. Back by dinner. Don't worry about me." She smiled at the familiar, neat handwriting. But as the hours passed, the house felt empty again. The silence that once comforted her now felt hollow. She tried to distract herself with chores, books, even music, but nothing worked. When he finally came home that evening, covered in dust and tired, she felt an unexpected wave of relief. "You look exhausted," she said. "Long day," he replied with a grin. "Miss me?" "Maybe," she teased, but her tone was softer than before. They shared dinner again, and this time the silence was warm. As they talked, Claire noticed the small details. How he always listened fully when she spoke. How he smiled with his whole face. How he never tried to rush her. He wasn't asking her to forget her past. He was just showing her that the future could still be kind. Later that week, the library where Claire worked held a small community event. She invited him, not realizing how much it meant until he said yes. Watching him talk with her coworkers, laugh with strangers, and carry boxes for volunteers made her see him differently. Not just as someone who filled her empty house, but as someone who made her world brighter. On the drive home that night, the car was quiet. The city lights blurred outside the window, and Claire's mind raced. Finally, Adam broke the silence. "You looked happy tonight." "I was," she admitted. It felt good, to feel like part of something again. He smiled softly. "You are. You always were." She turned to him, meeting his eyes in the dim light. "Adam, she began, but stopped. He looked at her gently. "You don't have to say it yet," he said. "I can wait." That simple sentence filled the car with more warmth than any words of love could have. When they reached home, rain began to fall again, light and steady. Claire stood by the doorway as he brought in the groceries they'd picked up. She watched him laugh about something trivial, and for the first time, she let herself imagine what it would be like if he never left. That night, she sat awake in her room, listening to the rain, thinking about how one storm had brought him into her life, and how another might be the moment she finally stopped running from what she felt. The quiet house didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt alive. And as the rain fell softly against the windows, Claire finally whispered into the dark, "Maybe I'm ready." She didn't know if he'd hear her through the walls, but somehow she felt he already knew. The next few days passed quietly, but not in the way they used to. The silence in the house now carried a strange kind of peace. Claire felt lighter, though she didn't quite understand why. Adam had gone about his days as usual, fixing things around the house, helping neighbors, cooking meals when she forgot to eat. But there was a new softness in his presence. They didn't talk about what had happened by the fire or in the car that night, but both of them knew something had changed. It was late November when another storm came. The sky turned dark before evening, and the sound of thunder rolled in like an old memory. Claire stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Seems like the weather's trying to repeat history," she murmured. Adam walked up behind her, holding 2 mugs of tea. "Maybe it's just reminding us how we met," he said with a smile. She took the mug, their fingers brushing briefly. That tiny touch sent a familiar warmth through her chest. "You always know how to make things sound simple," she said softly. "Life is simple," he replied. "It's people who make it complicated," she laughed quietly. "You sound too wise for your age. Or maybe I just listen more than most." They sat down in the living room, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof. For a while, they said nothing. The sound of the storm filled the space. It reminded Claire of that first night when everything between them shifted, when she realized the quiet house no longer belonged to her alone. "Adam," she began hesitantly, "have you ever been afraid of wanting something too much?" He looked at her thoughtfully. "All the time," he said. "But I learned that fear doesn't protect you. It just keeps you lonely." His words stayed with her. She turned her gaze to the fire, watching the flames twist and dance. For so long, she had built her life around being careful not to hope, not to trust, not to feel too deeply again. But sitting there with him, surrounded by warmth and rain, she wondered if maybe safety wasn't what she really needed. A loud crash of thunder made them both jump slightly, then laugh. "You'd think we'd be used to this by now," Adam said, standing to check the windows. Claire followed him, handing him a towel as he secured the shutters. The storm was getting worse. "Power might go out again," she said. "Then we'll light candles," he replied easily. "We've done it before." When the lights flickered and went out, they both burst into laughter. "Called it," she said. He lit a candle, setting it on the table between them. The warm glow softened everything, the shadows on the walls, the lines of worry on her face. Claire found herself staring at him, realizing how much comfort his presence brought her. He noticed her gaze, but didn't say anything. Instead, he sat down and asked, "Do you ever miss the city?" "Sometimes," she said, "but I think what I really missed was feeling seen." Adam leaned forward slightly. You are seen, Claire, more than you know. The words hit her heart like a quiet truth she had been running from. She looked away, blinking back sudden emotion. You make it sound so easy to believe, she whispered. That's because it is, he said gently. You just have to stop fighting it. The rain grew louder, the wind howling outside, but neither of them moved. Something inside her broke open, a wall she'd held up for years. She took a deep breath. Adam, I don't know what this is between us, but it's different. It scares me because it feels real. He smiled faintly. That's how you know it's worth it. Claire's heart raced. For a long time, she had convinced herself that love wasn't meant for her anymore, that it was something she had already used up in her past. But sitting there, seeing the way he looked at her, not with pity, not with desire, but with quiet, steady affection, she realized she had been wrong. I've spent years trying to protect myself from pain, she said. But maybe I've been protecting myself from happiness too. Adam reached out, his voice low but steady. Then let me help you stop running. The simplicity of his words brought tears to her eyes. She didn't rush to answer. She just nodded slowly, feeling something inside her finally settle. A moment later, a loud knock echoed through the house, startling them both. They looked at each other, confused. Adam went to open the door, and to their surprise, it was a delivery driver, soaked to the bone, holding a small package. This came earlier, but the storm delayed me, he explained before rushing off again. Adam closed the door, chuckling. You ordered something? Claire frowned, taking the small box. I don't remember. She opened it and found an old photo frame inside, one she had ordered weeks ago for a memory she thought she'd never be ready to face. Inside the box was a picture of her late husband and her younger self, smiling by the sea. She went silent. Adam watched her carefully, unsure what to say. After a while, she placed the photo gently on the mantel. He was a good man, she said softly. Losing him broke me. I know, Adam said quietly. And I'm not trying to replace him. I know you're not, she replied. You're just reminding me that life didn't end with him. The storm outside began to calm, the thunder fading into a soft drizzle. Claire turned toward Adam, her eyes reflecting both sadness and peace. I think I was afraid to let go because I thought it would mean forgetting him, she said. But maybe it means making room for something new. Adam nodded. That's all love ever does. It grows. It doesn't erase. They stood there in the flickering candlelight, the world around them quiet once more. Claire felt the weight of her grief finally lift, replaced by something gentler, something that felt like hope. Thank you, she said quietly. For staying, for being patient, he smiled. I told you I'm not going anywhere. Outside, the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds. The storm was over. Claire walked to the window, pulling the curtains open. The world looked fresh, washed clean by the rain. She turned to Adam, her heart full. I think, she said with a soft smile, this house doesn't feel so quiet anymore. He walked up beside her, their shoulders almost touching. Maybe it never was, he said. Maybe it was just waiting for you to listen. She laughed, tears glimmering in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt ready to move forward, not with fear, but with faith in what lay ahead. As the morning sun filtered through the wet glass, Claire looked at Adam and whispered, I'm glad you knocked on my door that stormy night. He smiled, his eyes warm and steady. Me too, Claire. Me too. The house stood still and peaceful, no longer a place of loss, but one of quiet beginnings. And somewhere in that soft morning light, between two hearts that had been searching for the right time to heal, everything finally changed, just as it was always meant to.